So quickly, I'm Aaron. I'm a senior consultant with Attain, and I've been doing Drupal and Salesforce integrations now for going on 6 or 7 years in a variety of clients at a variety of sizes. I've done everything from working on the Salesforce side of it to being part of building out the actual suite that's used for doing a lot of the integrations. So I've been around a while and done more than a few of these.
And my name's Chris Pifer, and I'm a principal consultant with Attain, and I've been working with Drupal for over a decade now, but these days I'm doing mostly Salesforce work. So Attain is a firm. We're about a 600-person firm that does primarily federal and nonprofit and higher ed projects. And we have a Salesforce group that also does work with Drupal as well. So we're one of the few shops that does both. This session, we're talking about Salesforce as, but it's really, this is kind of an overall lens of how do you get Drupal to play well with the rest of your ecosystem? So with a lot of our clients, a lot of large nonprofits, a lot of government settings, you have a lot of tools, and putting together a Venn diagram that's like this one is incredibly important for setting up your overall integration strategy and thinking about what plays what role in the system. And it's incredibly important to think about each of the tools that you have and make sure they play their position, if to use a sports analogy. Play to their strengths and find something else where there are weaknesses. So, working with Drupal, we all know so well, content-centered. It's a good tool for rendering content to an audience, to the general public. The licensing fees are great in terms of, how much it costs to have people log into the site or visit the site. It excels at sort of public-facing content. Salesforce, on the other side, cloud software as a service product, does a lot of things with declarative tools. So, we did an implementation for the Boston Marathon recently, and they're managing a huge chunk of their work without any custom code, using declarative tools that allow you to click around and build, kind of like happens in the Drupal space, click around and build sets of automation. So whenever you're looking at two different systems like this, you need to then look at where is the overlap and make decisions strategically around which service is going to provide and fill in the gaps where the two different tools overlap. So, Salesforce has a product called Salesforce Communities, which does a lot of things like what you get with organic groups or the groups module in Drupal. And so, okay, we've got two different tools, depending on how you want to use it, where you want to use it, making a choice where those Venn diagrams overlap. And coming up with an effective strategy means, in particular, deciding what the system's going to do and sticking to it. So it may be tempting to use that feature that's really good, that solves a particular problem. But if Drupal's supposed to be doing it and not Salesforce, then you really need to stick to that. So as I was saying, it's never just these two tools. In most large organizations, you've got somebody else threw together a WordPress site in there, and that's providing your microsites, and maybe there's a learning management system or student information system that's out there that you need to think about. How do all these pieces fit together? And you can end up with these really beautiful Venn diagrams with 6 or 7 different systems in the picture. And also, it's important when you're doing this to think about growth. Think about where you're going to be plugging in new systems, or where are there really gaps where none of the tools that you're currently using solve the problem.
So, as Chris has been talking about, making sure that your overarching project is well planned, in part because these aren't when you're talking about your primary constituent relation system and your primary content management system, neither of those are tools you change on a monthly basis. Your CRM in particular, you're probably talking about a tool you're not going to replace for 10 or 15 years. Your CMS might get updated more frequently than that, or at least go through a major overhaul. Both of these are systems that are likely to be around for a long time and need to interact for a long time. So you need to have a plan in place that's going to hold up over a long period of time. These are not things you build and then walk away from 6 months later. Your technical debt matters really quickly in a big way. And so for every project, if there's all the systems in it need to be discussed in every project in those systems. You can't walk into a project and realize that, oh yeah, there was that overhaul happening in the finance system, and for our new audit standards, we changed out how we're recording transactions, and oh, does that work with the brand new credit card processing solution we just picked over here? That you need to make sure all of those things are on the table throughout the whole project. And you need to know who owns each piece of the solution. Each system in it needs to have a clear person that you can look at and point to and say, okay, you own this piece of the project, this is your system, and every time we're talking about it, I'm going to make sure you're in the conversation, and I'm not going to leave you behind. So that you know you have the right people at the table, that the right people are checking the plans. As you build out your documentation and interconnect your system, you need to document each piece of that connection. Every single connection, you need to know that they're connected and why, and you need to write that down somewhere, because again, you're going to live with this for 5, 10 years. Some of those systems are going to be replaced. You want to make sure you know what they were there to do, who owns it, and how they're connected and where, so that when you replace it, you know the side effects of that. It's not that you're going to be stuck with it, because it's not irreplaceable, but if you don't write it down, you're going to break things when you go to do those updates. Every piece of data needs to have a canonical system that owns it. Again, you're talking about a long-term solution. At some point, your systems will end up in conflict. Somehow, you will end up with things were down too long, a synchronization didn't happen, somebody made an error and overrode something and made a change they shouldn't have made. Somewhere, the data is going to come into conflict, and you need to know which system is your default system to trust. For every piece of data all the way across, you're going to have to clean up someday, so know which system is in charge. And then every piece of data that you're sharing, you should have a reason to justify that sharing of data. If you're going to have one data point appear in 2 systems, you need to know why. Because again, if they end up in conflict, that's a piece of data you have to sort back out. So make sure you put the effort in to justify each one of those decisions all the way across. I recently was working on a solution where we're inheriting a system, and there are a whole bunch of the IDs getting replicated throughout. And it's not clear why. And it is a place where
IDs are great. Why not? You know?
Let's just pass them all through all the systems. What they are is an opportunity for conflict. Instead of one point being, we know this ID goes to this ID, these 2 records match, we have those in 3 or 4 places, which means if they stop matching, I have no way to know which record it was supposed to be anymore. I just know that at some point those 2 matched, and now over here these 2 match, and in this system these 2 match, but they may not be the same.
Handling data merges, if you're looking at contact records, for example, is a great, you can imagine all the different ways that has to be propagated across all the different systems, or it doesn't happen right, and you end up with a mess.
And there can be, sometimes the reasons aren't wonderful and you're not happy with them, but you should know why your data is shared and know why it exists in multiple systems.
So these are just sort of general everything everyone should consider when you're looking at systems integration projects, when you're looking at Salesforce or any other system talking to Drupal. you know, there's this, Salesforce has this feature that's called outbound messages that can be tied into a workflow. And it's this really quick and easy thing. A lot of non-technical Salesforce administrators will go in and click around and set up a workflow that'll send out an outbound XML message to an external system. And they're like, great, we've got our integration. It doesn't do anything to verify the message was received. It doesn't do anything, there's no mechanism to sort of check, to act upon errors that happened. So if the data doesn't really matter, if you just, that's somebody else's system, will just send it out there, then that's a great tool for doing your integration. In most cases, people really care about the data that they're working with. And so you have to think about all of the different things that can happen when something goes wrong. So one of the first things, and this is particularly an issue in the Salesforce world, but this can happen with any of your systems. Salesforce has a massive server farm. I have no idea how many boxes are behind our Salesforce instance, but when a Salesforce admin does an update to 100,000 records, and then you try to push those 100,000 records to your Drupal site all at once, you've just DDoSed yourself. So figuring out a system for rate limiting is a really good place to start. And also, along with that, what are the relative capabilities of each of these systems and the load that they can handle? So your rate limits will probably be system specific. Along with that, queuing. So a lot of times when we get started looking at an integration project, the client will say, oh, it's got to be real time. And right there, I mean, you combine that with a rate limiting solution, and it's not truly going to be real time. And Salesforce has a limitation where there's only a certain number of API calls you can do before you've hit your limit for the 24-hour period. And so it's not, you have to sort of plan for what happens when we're approaching that API limit. And if we know that we've just hit it, what happens to all this data that we need to have properly synchronized between the two different systems? And along the same lines, error handling. What happens when your Salesforce admin has just added a required field? It's this really nice, you can just click required, just like in Drupal, hit required, and that's, it's really easy. And I wanted staff to fill that out, so I made it required, and you've just broken your integration. Is there a retrying mechanism built in to the integration that you've designed? How do you catch up if the two systems are out of date? Are you able to properly identify these are the records that need to be caught up? And is it just going off of date stamps and timestamps? Or is there actually a mechanism in the integration that says, these records have been synced and they are marked as synced, and these records are out of date and need to be synced? So, just focusing on the Drupal to Salesforce connection, there are lots of other tools, and this applies to lots of other technologies as well. So how do you integrate Drupal with Salesforce, and what tool do you choose? So there is this cool Salesforce module, the Salesforce Suite, drupal.org/project/Salesforce. Aaron spent some time working on that in one of his previous jobs. It's all the great things that you'd expect of a native Drupal module. There's native versions for Drupal 7, Drupal 8, and it provides a number of the core features that I just talked about: rate limiting, queuing, error handling, and retries. One of the most common challenges that we run into using it is that it has a one-to-one object model. So a Drupal entity maps to a Salesforce object. Sometimes that's great. A Salesforce contact maps to a Drupal user, and you've got a community portal. But when somebody fills out an event registration and you want to take credit card payment, update their contact record, etc., you're actually probably hitting 4 or 3 objects at once, and having a mechanism to handle that smoothly takes something beyond just using the Salesforce suite. there's a technique that we're using on one of our current projects. Salesforce has a capability of creating a custom web endpoint, just basically a REST target that you can call and get data back. And so this is sort of the very simple, very lightweight. We don't actually want to synchronize these systems. Drupal doesn't actually care about a donor's giving history. What they care about is being able to display the donor giving history to the donor when they log into the portal. So, it's really lightweight. Drupal will just send back some JSON, send back some XML. It's helpful for if you can turn on BigPipe in Drupal 8, get that data back real quick. It's read-only. You're not writing back to Salesforce without, and it also has the potential of a lot of API calls. It can be really chatty. Somebody's sitting there refreshing their page on their donor. I don't know why they do that, but if a donor was sitting there doing that, like that's hitting your API limit in Salesforce. And there's not a lot available there to sort of manage the number of requests that are coming in, short of keeping track of it on the Salesforce side and being aware that you're gonna, need to have a plan for when you hit your API limit and people can't see their giving history. Another solution that's out there are these ETL tools, extract, transform, load tools. Jitterbit is a common one, Informatica, there's a whole bunch of them. They tend to be pretty pricey. A lot of them start in the 5-figure range, and they're very system agnostic. They'll talk to Salesforce, they'll talk to Drupal, they'll talk to Postgres, they'll talk to, name your tool, NetSuite, whatever. They'll even talk to things that they don't know about. They give you some tools to sort of build an integration. And oftentimes, like these are pretty common in higher ed settings or where there's a lot of systems, and you want one place where you're managing all your integrations. Like I said, they're pricey, and they are on the Drupal side. There's this weird challenge with them, which is, it talks to MySQL. It doesn't talk to Drupal. So have you ever tried to reverse engineer the database structure in Drupal and then do all the necessary writes to all the different tables to update a complex entity, for example? You have to do that with the ETL tool because it's not gonna be calling Drupal. It isn't necessarily going to be calling Drupal. You can set it up also so that it talks to the Drupal REST API, and that's definitely the way to go. We see both in different clients that we've worked with. You really want to be sure that you're talking intelligently to the system that you're trying to integrate with, as opposed to trying to sneak stuff in behind the scenes. And then, of course, because it's Drupal, you can do a custom module that does exactly what you want, or exactly as much as your budget dictates. For example, let's say you want the capabilities of the Drupal Salesforce suite, but you want it to talk to multiple Salesforce objects. Great, you can write that yourself, and you're reinventing the wheel, and you don't have community support. If you're a big enough shop to handle that, or a big enough organization to handle that, I mean, there's a bit of a gap there that you could fill. There are obviously other techniques for integration out there as well, but these are some of the more common tools that we see in the ecosystem. And there's a right place for all of these tools. There's not, none of them is always the solution. Along with this, there are different architectural approaches to how you think about the data flow that can have, provide for different requirements, satisfy different needs. As I mentioned before, clients often are asking for that real-time push. They want, I hit save in Drupal and I need to see it on the contact record within a second in Salesforce. That technique tends to be less durable. You're more likely to have a problem. You're more likely to have rate limiting problems. Let's say your website gets, shows up highly on Reddit, and you've got lots and lots of people hitting it. That's going to be really chatty with the Salesforce APIs. It's not built for volume. The fallback that often sort of people go to is a cron-based sync. Build it into, you call it with Drupal's cron. It has criteria for these are the records that need to be synced. You need to have sync happen, and you can, if you get hit by a huge amount of traffic, you can just stop the cron job and let it catch up later. There's a greater risk of data conflict that happens here. If you've got 4 or 5 systems in the picture, somebody does an update in the student information system, that gets pushed to Salesforce. Somebody does, at the same time the person's logged into your Drupal portal, they do an update in Drupal. Which wins? And that goes back to some of the governance questions that Aaron was talking about. We want to be really sure that that you should have rules, business rules that are executed in code, ideally, around which system wins, or at least you've anticipated we can have data conflicts with this particular architecture. And so if we run into a conflict scenario, we can properly detect it and make sure that there's, it could be just flag the record, make sure a human looks at it next, especially if there's complex conflict scenarios. The final design architecture that I want to mention is a work queue design. And this kind of can be a little sort of halfway between what's the 2 different models. So this is where you sort of create an integration entity in Drupal. You throw all the data that you want to be integrating into that entity, and then send it over to Salesforce. And there's a relatively short schedule for grab the work that needs to be done, send it over, and back and forth. And this is a design that we use this design for the Boston Marathon. Actually, they needed to handle 1,000 concurrent users on the form in a second. Like when they open registration for the marathon, it's like a rock concert. So we couldn't do that. We couldn't do that real time. But they also have the media saying, "So, how is registration going? Like, where are we at?" So what we ended up with was just take the form submission, dump it directly into Salesforce. Don't do anything with it in Salesforce, just dump it into Salesforce. As a flat object, there's no lookups, there's no dependencies, there's no risk of record locking. Just get it in. And then that was our work queue, that object. And Salesforce just had a scheduled job that, what do I have in the work queue? Grab the next item, do the work. And that split it out, find the contact, did all their duplicate matching, created a race registration record, created qualifying time records, all like 6 or 7 objects all needed to be created at once with that submission. But there was no lag for the user on the form when they click submit. So there are other integration architectures out there, but I mean these are 3 that I think work well with Drupal and work well with thinking about these 2 systems in particular and how to get them to talk well to each other depending on your requirements.
So I was saying earlier, it's important to know which systems are involved in your project so you have all the right people in the table. When I start projects, one of the things I like to do is have a map, and usually based on logos just because it's attractive, it makes it easier for people to consume. But looking at what are the tools involved in this solution and which are connected to which others, and which direction is information flowing. And starting with a high-level picture so you can start looking for problems early on and getting a sense of your complexity. Are you looking at a solution where information like this is going to be nicely gated, that stuff coming in from Eventbrite is going to pass just to Drupal, and then it's going to pass to Salesforce, and I know each step along the chain who's in charge and what's moving forward and what's coming back the other way. And I know, I can look at the chart and I know that there's not going to be a loop all the way around, that somebody making a change in Eventbrite is going to cause a storm because I'm getting a write back from Moodle that's going to cause me a headache later. That I can look at that picture and think it all the way through. But again, they rarely stay simple. Rarely are there a mere 4 or 5 systems on the table.
This is from an actual project, or a variation on an actual project.
Yeah, this is a variation from a client we are working with that has a wide variety of things tied particularly to their Salesforce instance. But Drupal is writing back through form assembly to provide PCI compliance on their credit card charges. They've got a variety of things within Salesforce. This is a slightly simplified view of where things actually stand. And there's reporting in other systems. And so being able to chart that out and looking for things like, okay, we do have things passing through a loop as they go from Salesforce to Drupal to form assembly back to Salesforce. And being thoughtful about that and knowing ahead of time that that's going to be something to keep an eye on. Because you don't want uncontrolled loops. Uncontrolled loops are bad, particularly if you're using a synchronizing approach that isn't really, really fast. And again, Salesforce in particular isn't built around high-speed integration. That's not one of its strengths. It's got a lot of great strengths, but super fast integration isn't among them. And so I've seen projects. Yeah. Sure, I was just about to. So I had I worked on a project where Drupal was writing to Salesforce. Salesforce had a synchronization to a third system. It wasn't Oodle, but I couldn't find its logo. And then it was coming back into Drupal. And, what would happen is somebody would make a change in Drupal. It would get pushed to Salesforce. If somebody made another change, it was actually their authentication system. So it was essentially Active Directory. They make a change over there, that pushed to Drupal on login, but not on a scheduled basis. It didn't push to Salesforce at all. That was expected to be done manually, that you would maintain the change of somebody's name independently. And what was happening was somebody's name kept resetting. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. Because anytime I checked any one part of the integration, it was fine. But what wasn't happening was somebody would make the change they made the change in Salesforce and they made the change in Drupal, but they forgot to update Active Directory. And the changes back and forth, Salesforce, everything's happy. Stable it, and then they log in again. Except for I didn't, right? My test user logged in exactly when I knew they would. Yeah. Turns out real people log in whenever they feel like it. They don't call me when they do that. So I spent days trying to figure out why it was that this guy's name kept flipping back. But it was it's one of those, you knew it was an integration problem because it kept reoccurring and it kept going back to the same thing. You knew that data was somewhere. But it didn't occur to me that it was coming from their login system. Another place I've seen it is because it was a cron loop, the updates started to chase each other around. So it was it was a loop like this, it was a loop all the way around this, and it was always one step behind because everything ran on the hour. So system A, the data just hopped out of the way before it got there. And so at first you didn't see it because it was slow updates, only a couple of records. But as the system aged, you picked up more and more data and you start hitting your API limits at Salesforce. You're going, how are we, we get 20 changes a day. How are we hitting a 20,000 or 50,000 record, or, call limit? And it's because there was a cron job with 50,000 calls in it that had built up over 6 months because it just was kept going around the loop. So it's looking for things, are your timestamps are you using timestamps? Are your timestamps right? Are you accidentally checking timestamps at both ends? Are you saying check the Drupal timestamp and the Salesforce timestamp? They don't match by definition because you updated at one point and then your cron job ran. That took a couple of seconds at least. And so the timestamp at Salesforce is later. If you then copy that data back because it's newer, now your Drupal timestamp's newer. So you push it again.
And this is just you don't even need a third system in that picture. Just go back and forth as long as that's how you hit your API limit.
And that one, if you do a custom integration, you'll run into those. The Salesforce suite in particular, that's one of the things that has been matured into it years ago. That was one of the challenges we used to run into in early versions of it was we'd get these little storms because we were not checking the timestamps right. You check the timestamps right and that goes away. Salesforce suite gets that right. But if you build a custom integration, it's a really easy mistake to remake and put back into your solution.
The other thing I'd add with this really quick is that especially, this is really true on both sides. It can be, when you've got point and click tools, it can be really easy to sort of set up chains of events that have integration implications that are hard to see. And so you can create a loop where it's not even hitting the same object, but the update to the user record creates an update to 2 records in Salesforce, and the second record in that chain pushes back to a third system or pushes back to Drupal, and you end up with a loop that includes 2 steps within Salesforce. So that can, really there almost has to be an integration checkpoint in every architecture and design that you're doing, making sure that you aren't going to be creating a loop with your updates.
And that's why, I said at the beginning, it's important to have documentation and maintain your documentation. On one hand, we all say that a lot about everything in our projects. In integrations, it's one of those places where it will eventually come back and bite you. You will get behind in your documentation. You will get sloppy. Something will break, and then you will have a problem. And again, when we're talking about solutions that are going to last 5 or 10 years, to some extent, I will always advocate for doing the documentation right. I will also always recognize that someday you're going to make a mistake, because we're all of us are short on time and short on attention span, and documentation is boring. It's always the last priority. But once you get burned, then you get really aggressive about it. And I mean down to every field. It's not just those big system diagrams, although I start with them because that's where you can see your loops. You know that you have a place to look for a problem. You know you have a place that you're risking a problem. But if you're not diagramming down to every field, you could miss it. You could miss those places where, oh, this one's going to fire that workflow, which is going to cause this Apex update, which is going to change that timestamp, which I'm now reading back over here, and I just found my loop. And you have to be zoomed in all the way down to every field and every data type, all the way across it. It really requires a very waterfall-like approach, frankly, that a lot of that has to be planned very thoroughly. That if you try to, you can, it's not that agile shops can't do it, they absolutely can, but if your sprints get too small, you don't end up stopping and checking those big pictures. A lot of places will get into that. I'm solving this problem, I'm completing the story. And they forget that the story is part of this much larger epic that's at risk because if you don't pull all the way back out.
This document is not a design artifact. It's not something you can just throw away from your sprint and not pay it. It has to have a life of its own. It has to have maintainers. And we do this for every project that involves integrate. I mean, we do this really for every project because almost always there's a data migration step as well. But unless your data doesn't matter, or it's okay if the system's down because you hit your API limit or DDoSed your website, you really have to maintain this stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think you implicitly hit on the biggest reason that documentation gets out of date there, which is when you first stand up a project or you do an integration project, you go through the effort of doing that documentation. Now everything's connected, but usually the owners of the systems are different, and it's not one party having this umbrella-like view. So now I'm over here, I'm doing my Salesforce stuff, he's over there, he's doing his Drupal stuff. We're maybe updating documentation that we see as relevant to our system, but nobody ends up with the ownership of the overall architecture.
Exactly. Just to restate that for the recording, so nobody ends up with the ownership of the overall architecture, so you end up with, after you go live, documentation getting out of sync or integrations getting out of sync.
And yeah, for long-term maintenance, and again, some of that is, for any of these projects, walking into them recognizing that this is a project that will require maintenance, and that you're kind of aware that what's going to happen. Because yeah, once you've got it, now you've got a puppy. And they are sweet and they are wonderful, and I love Henry. Henry is awesome. But he goes to the vet, and he requires regular shots. He requires an ongoing maintenance relationship with my vet. And occasionally he walks in with a broken toe, and he ends up with a cast and 6 weeks of leash walking and physical therapy and all kinds of craziness to get him sorted back out. Your integration project needs to be understood the same way you're going to maintain a pet, that you're going to care for your pet. This is something that you have to know when you start, that this isn't just a build it and if my vendor wanders off, it's going to be fine. It's going to be a long-term relationship. You may be, you can change out your support vendor, but there's got to be support in the plan from the very beginning, whether that's going to be in-house inside an organization or whether that's going to be a third party, that capacity has to be there. Because you will get behind in your documentation, your data will get out of sync, and someone's going to have to clean it up. And somebody's got to be owning those things from the very beginning. And it can't be like, oh, by the way, you need a support contract. Hope you don't mind, but we're going to be together for the next 10 years. Did we forget to tell you that?
The other thing with that is, I mean, if it's a large enough client, I would really recommend having an integration architect on staff if you have the resources, where their job is purely to make sure they know what all is going on in all the systems and having that big picture. And a lot of organizations don't have the resources for that, or their integrations aren't quite big enough or complex enough that it makes sense to have that person on staff. But, I mean, I worked for a small nonprofit for a number of years, and we absolutely saw the implications of, like, I learned a lot of this stuff the hard way working for a small nonprofit and needing to back out 300,000 rows of changes in Salesforce that we, because we deleted something wrong in Drupal. So,
Sorry about that. I might have been the vendor on that project.
We've known each other for a while. But I mean, I think that regardless of what the plan looks like, making sure your integration has an overall lifecycle plan is absolutely critical. So this is a small enough group. I'd actually love to hear a little more about who y'all are and what your role is. Why'd
you come?
Yeah. Go for it.
She's been here on the Georgia Tech Professional Education. By title, I'm a senior graphic designer, but I'm like in the group, so I always work with applications that we employ or deploy in the marketing department.
Sure.
And so I'm now acting as a digital operations lead. Managing relationship with me, you're currently doing most of the heavy lifting. And so we basically did a website redesign, Salesforce integration, and now we're trying to do marketing cloud, like all of this. So it's ambitious. Yeah, so right now we have web forms that are pushing data to Salesforce and we're not having coming back. And we're sending out emails from their cases, we're doing events from those forms, and we have dashboard as our event application. And so, yeah, we're like the marketing cloud is the fuzzy logic right now.
Well, and one of the things that's hidden in that is, for people who don't know the Salesforce ecosystem, Marketing Cloud is a Salesforce product, but it was originally ExactTarget, and it's still on the .NET stack that ExactTarget was using, and so it's an integration behind the scenes. They don't like to talk about it that way, but it is actually an integration that has all of these same considerations and concerns.
CTO at Mellon Technology. Interestingly enough, the main draw for me was also Marketing Cloud. But we've done some other Salesforce integrations, and I, in my spare time, am our Salesforce administrator for the company too. Because no one else wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, a lot of that. A lot of both Salesforce and Drupal administrators are, hey, you weren't here for this meeting. Guess what you signed up for?
Or you're not afraid of a computer, which was, at my nonprofit, we had a vendor we were working with for the original Salesforce implementation, and right after we went live, my boss showed up in my office, and she said, I fired him. You know how to run this thing, right? I was a Drupal developer. I was around for the Salesforce project, but I learned Salesforce pretty quickly.
Hi, I'm Santanu Bose. I manage a Drupal development team at Turner. So the way we are organized is we have teams for different sites, like PBS, TNT, NCAA, they have their own Drupal development team, but my team does the core components that are shared across all those brands. And we might do something with Salesforce. That's why I'm kind of interested to see like what they are today and where there's some gaps that we may fill.
Do you currently have Salesforce in place and looking at integrating or considering it?
Not much, there is some marketing activity that happens with Salesforce, but we have other products like Braze and other things. So the integration is almost not there and maybe done ad hoc by different brands. So I'm just looking for the right time when it makes sense to do a core module where more brands would be really interested in some core functionality.
Others?
Sure. I'm Chris. I'm a lead Drupal engineer at Mindgrove. I typically lead smaller teams within Mindgrove on specific projects. More and more, we've been having things in the pipeline with not necessarily Salesforce, but Salesforce, SAP, and NCR integration. Some of them are Drupal, some of them are headless Drupal, some of them are completely outside of Drupal. But we have run into the problem with the data synchronization in the past, and that's what drew me in here is particularly getting a vendor involved in the complex data stack loops to take ownership and maintain that ownership throughout has been a particular challenge for us.
There was a side channel Hangouts conversation amongst a project team around that sort of. It is really helpful when a client is willing to sort of say, you're the vendor that owns all of the big picture, and there are oftentimes it's 3 or 4 different vendors in the picture, and there can be gaps and challenges, and yeah.
Making sure that's at least named upfront.
Exactly. Let's sit down and have an architecture conversation as an entire team of vendors, and yeah. So, okay. Yeah, exactly. You get this nice loop of data in a different format.
Hi, I'm Christina. I work at education nonprofits, and we currently have a custom database of all our users, and then a separate one for event management and e-marketing. And then we are now trying to implement Salesforce, which started with our financial systems, and now we're trying to use it as a customer database. And now we're also merging with another company, so we have HubSpot for marketing, a whole different website platform with WordPress, and then Drupal. And we're trying to build all these forms and integrations to make sure that they all work together. So,
whether there are efforts in the Drupal community to add one-to-many management to that suite of functions.
So I'm not aware of there are a couple of issues in the issue queue on the suite for handling parts of that problem. It's actually, it's a problem that gets really deep really fast, particularly because it's a suite designed to go two-way. And so how do I then continuously merge back the other way?
It's an ETL problem, like it's that transform step.
Right, and so there are pieces of it that the maintainers are interested in working on, particularly being able to. Right now, it only maps one. Get this right. It's one bundle type, so one entity bundle type gets one mapping. You can't multi-map it. And that is a problem that is slated for work at, like, if MediaCurrent wanted to contribute that patch, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk about it. To do the more complex of how do I take this, web form submission content entity and shatter it into 6 Salesforce objects, I'm not aware of that being a problem that the traditional answer out of the maintainers on the suite, having spent a lot of time with them, is that those are problems to solve on one end of the system or another, that it's not part of that by the time you're doing that, usually the declarative tools start to get super hard to use anyway, and building a sane interface on the Drupal side is never been anything somebody's been willing to fund, and just even the figuring out how you build the interface, let alone make it work. And so it's either done in custom code. The hooks and the events are all there in both the 7 and 8 suites. You can absolutely manipulate that data to create those, make it into several entities, break it apart, map all those entities and send it across. That transform step, though, has to happen in hooks currently, or events. 8 has events. Or you push it to Salesforce and you put it into some kind of holding object, and then you do the same kind of thing that Chris was talking about with Boston Marathon, where you do that processing, where you do have declarative tools that have a couple of orders of magnitude larger budgets behind them, and resources in terms of being able to work through some of those issues for pulling it apart and doing that. But again, those are for one-way data pumps. The only times I've seen somebody attempt to do a bidirectional multi-object, that kind of synchronization, it became a data disaster. That constant remerging was always wrong. That it was fun, like you could do it on paper and you could do it in a test example, but by the time you hit kind of real world application, to some extent you hit you're doing something wrong. If you can't figure out how to set this up as multiple objects, and in one system, and you have it as multiple objects in another, you probably have an actual problem here that you need to solve, and it's not a data solution. It's a bigger issue.
One thing I might add that we did a module where we did bidirectional, but we still did one directional, but it was able to handle more complex data structure. Maybe there's some entity references or other things, 3 where we use tokens to get some part of your data structure, or we have some custom code that you can add, like maybe a service that gives you some specific things out of your data model. And also just a field out of the main content entity or some other entity. We had provided 3 or 4 different methods to get to your data and push it to the other system. That way, even if you have a complex graph on the Drupal side, you can push it to the other system. We didn't do anything with the Salesforce, we just did the system. Something similar.
Yeah, and I really encourage folks to think about making, one of your systems is going to be more complex than the other, and you're going to have better resources in an org on one side or the other. Put your complexity where your resources are. So if you have stronger Drupal developer, use the hooks, use the events, and make Drupal do the transformations. If you've got stronger Salesforce support, do it on the Salesforce side. But figure out where that complexity is going and then attack it there. So we are at time.
Sure. Yeah.
My name is enterprise architect for the department. And what I'm hearing is a question that's not being asked. How have the world as itself managed to resolve this problem in banking, in finance, in the airline industry? Yeah, where they have multiple disparate systems. And they're using a technology that I haven't been mentioned here at all. The messaging system. There are things like MQ from IBM.
Salesforce just bought MuleSoft. Salesforce just bought MuleSoft. Which even for enterprise scale clients that we often work with, MuleSoft often is in the 6 figures. But you're right, that messaging.
That's where it is at.
Well, you've got RabbitMQ if you want to go open source, but I think that one of the problems you run into is that you've got another system that requires a degree of complexity for developers. So unless you've got high volume,
it comes back to the size of the enterprise, how the value, the consistency of the data. The publishing the system subscribe. The fact that it's guaranteed one-time delivery. So you don't have the problems that I'm hearing being discussed. It
Sure.
can't set the price tag.
Yes, exactly.
At
That's a
the
fair
same
point.
time,
Yep.
I'm hearing and I'm seeing that Drupal is now moving towards the top end of the enterprises, or the upper echelons of the enterprise.
And yeah, most of the tools are built around, still, even as Drupal is moving up the stack, are still built around smaller budgets. I think, yes, when you get into those budget sizes, then many of these problems become less common and easier to solve because you start working at the ETL as cheap and the integration expert to make it run as a cost of doing business, then those problems that are often the high-end solutions become much more in range.
And I think that, there's a fair point there around like the architecture of the Drupal Salesforce suite that could be poked at. Is there a messaging-based design that could be added to the suite that would better handle these problems? That's yeah. That's it.
I want to be respectful of Chris here and let Chris get settled in. And
I guess one final thing that I would add is that we are primarily the Drupal presence at Attain, at least within the Salesforce Services group. We are looking for partners to work with. If you have a Drupal Salesforce project and you're looking for somebody to work with, we're primarily on the Salesforce side. We also will do some Drupal implementations as part of it.
And we're happy to work with your Drupal vendor to make that happen.
Yes. Thank you all.